New information this morning in the case where 16 children were rescued from a house in Vinton County described as not fit for livestock. 13 News is digging deeper into this case. We've uncovered new information and confirmed through official documents that there were even another set of twins born into the Siders family. This set of twins, however, died the same day they were born.
16 kids, one house, and a phone. Before we get into anything else, sit with that combination for a second. Because it's the part of this case that breaks the story everyone thinks they already know. Officials stood in front of cameras and said these children looked feral, said some of them couldn't speak, said the oldest, 18 years old, couldn't even write her own name. That's the version of this story that went viral. That's the version everyone's comment section is built around. But there's a detail that almost got lost in the headlines about feces and flies and a 12 by 12 room. Some of these same children, the ones who supposedly couldn't speak, couldn't write, had never sat in a classroom. Some of them had Snapchat. Screenshots have surfaced online. Private messages. One from a teenage girl inside that house to a boy overseas she called her internet boyfriend. A defense attorney is now using that fact to argue the entire case has been exaggerated from day one. A retired detective who's seen this exact playbook before says it actually proves almost the opposite of what the defense thinks it proves. And there's a second search warrant executing on that property right now this week, with investigators saying parts of the house may not even be safe enough for them to walk into. So which is it? Were these kids trapped, isolated, cut off from the entire world for years? Or is that description wildly overblown, the way the defense is now arguing? I'm going to walk you through everything that's new. The religious language buried in this family's Facebook history, where Elizabeth Siders actually came from before any of this started. The exact law being used to prosecute 4 people who could each spend the next 12 years in prison, times 16. And the one unscripted moment in a courtroom that might tell us more about what's really going on here than any press conference has so far. Stick with me to the end, because the last piece of this, the second warrant, and what investigators still won't say about it, changes how you have to look at everything that came before it. Let's start with something almost nobody's actually explained plainly. What these 4 people are legally charged with, word for word, because the number 16 counts gets thrown around so much it's lost all its weight. The charge is Ohio Revised Code 291922, subsections B1 and E2D, endangering children. In a Vinton County courtroom, the judge read the actual statutory language into the record for each defendant, one at a time. All of these counts allege that you did, in Hamden, on or about June 30th, 2026, unlawfully abuse a child under the age of 18, and that violation resulted in serious physical harm to that child. 16 counts. One for every single child pulled out of that house. Every one of those counts is a second-degree felony. And here's the sentencing math that nobody has actually laid out clearly yet. Each second-degree felony charge carries a minimum of 2 years, up to a maximum of 8. With the statute allowing as much as 12 years on the outer end, depending on how it's ultimately charged. Add a fine of up to $15,000 per count. Add 18 months to 3 years of mandatory post-release control once any prison sentence ends. Now do that math across 16 counts. If a judge someday orders these sentences to run consecutively instead of concurrently, the theoretical maximum exposure for a single defendant runs into the hundreds of years. That's not hyperbole. That's just multiplication. Whether any judge actually goes there is a completely separate question, and it's years away from being answered. But it explains why every single attorney in this case, on both sides of the aisle, is treating this with the weight of a life sentence. Because for all 4 of these people, that's effectively what it is. All 4 defendants pleaded not guilty to those 16 counts. But the courtroom audio from that very first appearance reveals something that tells you a lot about how disoriented at least one of them was in that moment. And I don't think this detail has gotten nearly enough attention. When Gary Siders Sr. and Gary Siders Jr. were arraigned, they barely spoke. The judge asked how they'd like to plead. Both effectively deferred to counsel. Quiet, still, barely reacting to charges that could put them away for the rest of their lives. Then came Elizabeth. When the judge asked if she understood the charges and how she wished to plead, she started to respond, and according to courtroom audio, she actually began trying to explain herself, right there, in open court. The judge cut her off immediately. Stop. First of all, I want to remind you of your right to remain silent. This is not the time for you to argue your case. Think about what that 10-second moment actually tells you. A 33-year-old woman standing in front of a judge for the first time in her life, facing 16 felony counts, and her instinct wasn't silence, it was to talk, to explain, immediately, before her own lawyer could even stop her. Is that the reaction of someone with nothing to hide? Someone who genuinely believes she can just explain her way out of this? Or is it the reaction of someone who has simply never once, in her entire adult life, been taught how a courtroom works, what her rights even are, what silence is supposed to protect her from? That's exactly the kind of question a jury may eventually have to weigh. Right now, it's just one raw, unscripted moment that tells you she walked into that room fundamentally unprepared for what was happening to her. And if you want to understand why, you have to go back a lot further than June 30th. You have to go back to a mobile home park in Gallia County, Ohio, years before any of this, where a teenage girl first met the family that would define the rest of her life. Elizabeth Siders grew up in Gallia County, rural Appalachian, right next door to Vinton. According to reporting on the case, she met Gary Siders Jr. and his family while they were all living in the same mobile home park. A Siders family member, described as an uncle by marriage, told a local television station something that's become one of the most quoted lines in this entire case. He said Elizabeth did not have a very good home life when she and Gary Jr. got together, and that she essentially escaped into the Siders household, which he described as, back then, a normal American home. Sit with the word he chose, escaped, not ran away to, escaped. That word implies she was leaving something behind that was worse than whatever came next. What that was, nobody in this case has said on the record. But it completely reframes the marriage that followed. Not as one isolated act by a predatory older teenager, but as a 15-year-old choosing what looked, to her, like the better of two bad options. That choice led to Mason County, West Virginia, in March of 2008, where a judge approved a marriage license for a 15-year-old girl and an 18-year-old boy. Legal there, with parental consent, in a way it never could have happened just across the state line in Ohio. Marriage records show Gary Jr. had completed the 9th grade. Elizabeth had completed the 8th. Neither one appears to have gone any further in their education after that day. 2 months later, their first child was born, and from that day forward, according to her attorney, Tommy Stolle, Elizabeth's own explanation for everything that followed wasn't complicated. And it wasn't sinister, at least not in the way she told it to him. He said Elizabeth told him they always wanted a big family, that children are a blessing from God. That single phrase, a blessing from God, opens a door this case hasn't fully walked through yet. And I think it's one of the most important threads still unresolved. Christina Siders, the children's grandmother who goes by Lynn, has a documented social media history full of religious imagery, photos of Jesus, the Lord's Prayer posted over and over, a cross used as her profile picture on at least one account. None of that, on its own, means anything sinister. Millions of ordinary people post exactly the same things every single day. But combined with Elizabeth's own stated belief that every child was a blessing from God, and a family that had, by the time investigators finally arrived, grown to encompass 18 total pregnancies across less than 2 decades. It's raised an obvious question, both online and among some of the family's own relatives. Was there something more structured happening inside that house? A belief system, a hierarchy, something closer to what people colloquially call a cult, that helps explain both the sheer, almost unbelievable number of children and the family's apparent success at staying invisible for so long. As of this recording, investigators have not confirmed that theory, and they haven't directly addressed it either. It remains speculation, informed speculation, built on real, documented details, but speculation nonetheless. What we can say is that a forensic psychologist who reviewed the pattern of this case for Outside's commentary made a point worth sitting with. Covering up abuse on this scale for this many years requires real sophistication. The ability to consistently avoid both community resources and law enforcement almost never points to the youngest adults in a household. It points to whoever has been running things the longest. We're looking at the grandparents, essentially, right? The elder Siders and his wife as essentially being the catalyst for how these abuses could, number one, begin, but also kind of maintain. If that theory holds up, it puts Gary Siders Sr. and Christina Siders, not Elizabeth, not even Gary Jr., at the actual center of how this began in the first place. which makes the question of Gary Sr.'s competency even more consequential than it already was. If he's the architect of all of this, and he's ultimately found permanently unable to stand trial, what does justice even look like in a case like that? We don't have that answer yet. What we do have is proof that these children weren't nearly as cut off from the outside world as everyone initially assumed. And that single fact is currently being used by the defense to argue that the entire narrative around this case has been wrong from day one. Because here's the contradiction nobody's fully reconciled. Officials described children who couldn't speak, a sheriff who compared them to feral animals, an 18-year-old who investigators say couldn't write her own name, and yet reporters have found active social media accounts belonging to at least 2, possibly 3, of the older children in that house. Screenshots have circulated showing private messages, including an exchange between one of the older girls and someone she referred to as her boyfriend, reportedly overseas, someone she'd apparently met online and later broken up with. One message, reviewed by reporters, appears to actually show one of the girls speaking, a single word, in what may be a voice or video message. It sounds like a small detail. It is not a small detail. Gary Siders Sr.'s attorney, Dorian Baum, has leaned on exactly this contradiction publicly and hard. If they're so illiterate, how are they posting things online? If these are kids who are trapped in this place, typically when you see cases where people are trapped, they're not given internet access. They're not given social media pages. It's a fair question on its face. I want to be honest with you about that. But it's worth being careful here, because having a phone, and having a phone that's genuinely unsupervised and unrestricted, are two completely different things. Investigators haven't said whether these accounts were monitored by an adult in the household, whether they were used only under specific controlled circumstances, or whether they really were free and unrestricted the whole time. A single Snapchat account doesn't tell you whether a child was ever allowed to leave that house, whether she ever saw a doctor, whether she was ever able to say the word help to a single person who could actually act on it. It tells you a phone existed somewhere in that home. That's all it proves right now, on its own. Nothing more. What we do know is that this detail has become one of the defense's strongest talking points so far, and it's exactly the kind of contradiction a grand jury, and eventually a trial jury, is going to have to weigh against everything else investigators say they found in that 12 by 12 room. And speaking of that room, there's an update on the house itself that hasn't gotten nearly enough attention, and I think it might be the most important new piece of this entire story. The Ohio Attorney General confirmed something this week that a lot of coverage has completely glossed over. There is a second search warrant currently active on the Omer Street property. Investigators are still inside that house right now, or at least trying to be. He said it may not even be safe for deputies and agents to enter certain parts of the house, given the conditions. Read that back one more time. Weeks after the initial raid, parts of this residence are still considered hazardous enough that trained, protected law enforcement officers are being cautious about entering them. That is not a detail about neglect anymore. That's a detail about structural or biological conditions, serious enough to pose a real risk to adult professionals in full protective gear. Inside a home where 16 children, some of them barely out of toddlerhood, were living every single day of their lives. It's also worth remembering the scale of the very first response, because it tells you investigators knew immediately this wasn't routine. This wasn't 2 deputies and a piece of paper. Multiple agencies converged on that property the very first day. The Hamden Fire Department, Vinton County EMS, Jackson County EMS, the Jackson County Sheriff's Office, Ohio's Department of Natural Resources, Ohio's Bureau of Criminal Investigation. That is the footprint of a mass casualty response, not a welfare check. So what, exactly, are they still looking for, weeks later, in a house too dangerous in places to fully search the first time around? Officials haven't said. What they have confirmed is that whatever comes out of that second warrant could directly shape what the grand jury eventually sees. And it could be the difference between the 16 counts each defendant is currently facing and something significantly heavier. So let's put the fuller picture together, because this case has grown a lot since the first headline. 4 adults, each facing 16 second-degree felony counts under Ohio Revised Code 291922, charges that carry up to 12 years apiece and could theoretically stack into centuries if a judge ever ordered them served consecutively. A grandfather hospitalized, awaiting a competency and insanity evaluation that could freeze his entire case indefinitely. A mother asking for release, represented by an attorney who, by his own admission, still isn't sure whether she's a defendant, a victim, or somehow both at once. A family history that traces back through a mobile home park in Gallia County, a courthouse in West Virginia, and religious language that may or may not explain how 18 pregnancies happened across 18 years. Children with phones and social media accounts that complicate the entire picture of total isolation the state built its first press conference around. And a second search warrant active right now in a house investigators themselves say still isn't fully safe to walk through. None of these threads resolve the one question this case keeps circling back to, no matter how many new details come out. Was this poverty mismanaged into tragedy? Was it deliberate cruelty? Or was it something closer to control, even indoctrination, built up over 2 decades by people who knew exactly how to stay one step ahead of anyone who might have intervened? The honest answer right now today is that the evidence supports pieces of all three, and no one, not the prosecutors, not the defense attorneys, not the family members lining up to talk to reporters, has the full picture yet. Anyone who tells you they do is getting ahead of the facts. 16 children are safe tonight. Whatever else happens in that courtroom, that part isn't in dispute, and it never will be. Everything else, who's actually responsible, how much each of them understood, and what justice even looks like for a family this complicated, is still being written. One filing at a time, one evaluation at a time, one search warrant at a time. We'll be here for every part of it. If you want to see the moment the grand jury finally convenes, the results of Gary Sr.'s competency evaluation, or the ruling on Elizabeth's bond motion the second it drops, subscribe and turn on your notifications right now, because we will bring you every verified update the moment it becomes public. And if there's a thread in this case you think we haven't pulled on hard enough yet, put it in the comments below. We read every single one, and honestly, some of the best leads in this investigation have come from viewers who noticed something we didn't. Don't go anywhere because this case is nowhere near over and neither are we.